It's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Professor Jonathan W. White. Dr. White is a professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University. He is author or editor of 13 books and more than 100 articles, essays, and reviews on the Civil War. A number of his books on the Civil War have won or have been nominated for prestigious awards. Professor White is a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians and serves on the board of directors of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, the Abraham Lincoln Association, and the Lincoln Forum. Professor White holds a PhD and MA in United States history from the University of Maryland, College Park, and a BA in history from Pennsylvania State University. In 2019, he was selected for the Outstanding Faculty Award of the State Council of Higher Education, the highest award given to faculty in the Commonwealth. The book on which today's lecture is based, A House Built by Slaves, as well as others of Dr. White's books, are available for sale and signing downstairs immediately after the lecture. And now, Dr. White.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out on such a rainy day. I appreciate it. So I'm going to talk about two books that I published. The one I think you see over this shoulder is To Address You as My Friend, African Americans' Letters to Abraham Lincoln. And then the other one over this shoulder is A House Built by Slaves, African American Visitors to the Lincoln White House. And you can see some overlapping themes here. About 2014, I had the idea to start collecting letters from African Americans to Abraham Lincoln. I'm not sure how I came up with the idea originally, but I must have found a few letters and then began to find more and more and more. Before I knew it, I had 125 letters from African Americans to Lincoln. Some of them written by individual people, some of them signed by hundreds, one of them signed by 1,000 people. And so that got me thinking about the relationship that developed between African Americans and Lincoln, and I turned it into this book, To Address You as My Friend. And originally what I wanted to do with this book was have African American conversations and correspondence with Abraham Lincoln. But when I realized just how much material I was finding, it was more than I could do in one book. So I decided to get a twofer out of it. And so I published both of these last year. I want to show you some of the correspondents who wrote to Lincoln. If you look at this, these are about 20 of the men who wrote to Lincoln. Out of all the correspondence, I did find 21 women who wrote to Lincoln as well, although I have not found any of their photographs. If they ever were photographed, they don't survive. Some of these men were very famous in their day. Some of them are still famous today. If you look directly at the top center, I'm sure you all recognize Frederick Douglass. He wrote to Lincoln 2 times and met with Lincoln 3 times, and I'll talk about one of those letters in 2 of those meetings today. A lot of these guys were well known in their time. They're not well known today. Some of these would go on to become members of Congress, to become ministers, to become Army officers, and so I'll tell you some of their stories. I will highlight one of them, that guy there. This is just a little tease to get you to buy the book, although I don't know if this will work or not. But that man was a spiritualist and a sex magician. And he wrote to Lincoln in 1863 and also met with Lincoln. And I'm not going to tell you what a sex magician was in 1863. If you want to know, you're going to have to pick up the books. I do want to show you 2 of the letters, and you'll see some other ones throughout as I talk about some of the visitors, because a number of the people who wrote letters to Lincoln personally delivered them at the White House. But this is a letter from a man named Hannibal Cox. Hannibal Cox was born near Richmond, Virginia before the Civil War. He was born into slavery, and in Virginia it was illegal for enslaved people to learn how to read and write. So he was illiterate for much of his life. But when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Lincoln, allowing for the enrollment of black men into the Union Army, Hannibal Cox joined a black regiment, and he began to learn how to read and write. And in March of 1864, he sent this letter to Lincoln. And at the beginning of the letter, I don't expect you can read it from where you're sitting, so you'll have to take my word for it. At the beginning of the letter, he describes how he was born in slavery and was denied the ability to learn how to read and write. But now, as a soldier, he's serving his country, and he is learning how to read, and he wanted Lincoln, his commander-in-chief, to see what he was learning. And so he copied out some lines of a poem from Harper's Weekly, a poem about the American flag, and it showed his patriotism and what he was fighting for. But the thing I love about this letter is if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, you can see he made a little box, and he added a postscript there. And he wrote, "I sends this for you to look at. You must not laugh at it." And I love this sentiment because here you have a man who is a nobody today and was a nobody then, an ordinary person who wanted to write to the President of the United States. Why? To say, look at what I'm learning as a result of this Civil War and as a result of me serving in the Army. But Hannibal Cox firmly believed that Abraham Lincoln would hold this letter in his hands. And I think Cox knew that we naturally have an inclination as people to laugh at someone when they make a dumb mistake. I've got 2 little kids, and there are times where they say something really funny, unintending it to be funny, and I laugh, and they get upset with me then. And I think Cox understood his penmanship wasn't perfect, his spelling might have mistakes, and he worried that Lincoln's natural reaction would be to laugh at him. And so in sending this letter to Lincoln, he says, please don't laugh at it. And I have to believe that Lincoln didn't laugh when he saw this letter. You see, most of the letters that Lincoln received got routed through the federal bureaucracy and are now in some record group at the National Archives, depending on what part of the federal government they got sent to. The letters that meant the most to Lincoln, he kept, and they were found among his personal papers after his death, and they are now in his papers at the Library of Congress. And this is one of those letters. Lincoln kept this letter among the many others that he believed were most important to him. And so I think that says something really important. This letter in particular says something really important about the way African Americans came to view Abraham Lincoln during the war and the way that Lincoln came to feel a connection to African Americans. Out of the 125 letters in the book of correspondence with Lincoln, about 5 appeared as public letters in the newspapers, about 100 are in the National Archives, and about 20 were among Lincoln's personal papers that he kept as things that were particularly meaningful to him. When black men and women wrote to Lincoln, it was often to try to deal with a problem that they had no other recourse for dealing with. And so this one is one of my favorites, and this is a really incredible letter from a woman named Annie Davis. Annie Davis was enslaved in the state of Maryland. Maryland was not included in the Emancipation Proclamation because Maryland stayed in the Union. And in August of 1864, she wanted to visit some of her relatives on the Eastern Shore, but her mistress wouldn't let her go. And so, with nowhere else to turn, she writes to the President of the United States asking, "Am I free?" Now, sadly, at this point in August of 1864, Annie Davis was not yet free. But what she didn't know and what most people didn't know was that Abraham Lincoln was working behind the scenes to help orchestrate emancipation in Maryland. And within 2 months of this letter, in October of 1864, Maryland would vote to become a free state, and that would go into effect on November 1st, 1864. So Annie Davis was a few months away from freedom. But again, it shows not only the relationship developing between Abraham Lincoln and African Americans, but the fact that black people felt that they, for the first time in the history of the nation, had someone who occupied the White House who was concerned with what concerned them. And they were claiming a First Amendment right, a privilege of citizens to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision in 1857 had said black people are not citizens and have no rights which the white man was bound to respect. But by writing to Lincoln and by going to the White House to meet with him, they were claiming, we are citizens, we have rights that should be respected. Now, as I said, about 125 letters were sent from black people to Lincoln, and not only were those letters sent, but some were personally delivered to Lincoln, and hundreds of African Americans met Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. Sometimes these were at giant parties where there would be receptions, and anyone who wanted to could come to the White House to meet with Lincoln on New Year's receptions in 1864 and 1865. 1865 is when the most black people came to the White House during the Civil War. But what I want to do is tell you some of the stories of some of the black men and women who went to the White House and met with Lincoln. And some of them will have a local connection, but some of them will also be of national consequence. One of Lincoln's first visitors was this man here, Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls is very famous today because after the Civil War, he would go on to serve in Congress. When the Civil War began, Robert Smalls was a slave in Charleston, South Carolina. And he was 23 years old in 1862. He had a wife and several young children, and he knew the threat of slavery, that his family could be sold away from him. He was working on a ship called the Planter, which you see pictured here. It was a Confederate ship, and he was essentially working as a pilot on this ship in Charleston Harbor. And in May of 1862, he concocted a plan to steal the CSS Planter, take her out of Charleston Harbor, out to the Union blockading vessels, turn her over to the Union, and gain his freedom. Now, he didn't tell his wife and kids. He told a few close friends who didn't tell their families what they were doing because they didn't want word to leak out. And on May 13th, 1862, before dawn, Robert Smalls and 15 other slaves get onto the Planter. Robert Smalls is wearing a sort of white linen suit or shirt and a straw hat so that he looks like a captain. It's dark out, but he knows that the Confederates on the batteries along the shoreline will be able to see him, so he wants to look like he's supposed to be in command of this ship. Because he had been working on this ship, he knew the signals. And so as they left the harbor, he was able to signal to the Confederates who were guarding Charleston, and they thought he was a Confederate captain taking this vessel to sea. Now, this was an extraordinarily dangerous mission, because not only does he have to get past all these Confederate guards who might fire on him, but when he gets out to the Union blockading vessels, they're going to see a Confederate ship approaching before dawn, and they might think it's attacking. And so he might get shot and killed by the very people he's hoping will save him. He gets out there, he is able to persuade them not to fire, show them that he's a black man, there are 15 other black people on this ship, they are not Confederates, and they are brought into Union protection. And Robert Smalls becomes a hero, a national hero in the North because of this act of bravery. He travels to Washington, D.C. a few months later in August of 1862, and he gives a speech at Israel African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was pastored by this man, Henry McNeil Turner. There were 1,200 people who came out to hear Robert Smalls talk about his escape. And Henry McNeil Turner was not only a black pastor, but he was also a journalist, and he wrote for the AME newspaper in Philadelphia, the Christian Recorder. And he called Robert Smalls a specimen of a genuine specimen of African heroism. And Smalls' story spread throughout the North. And while Smalls was meeting in Washington, D.C. with various people, he went to the White House and met with Abraham Lincoln. Now, we don't know exactly what Robert Smalls said to Abraham Lincoln. The only account of this meeting that survives came from Robert Smalls in 1886. When Robert Smalls was a member of the House of Representatives, he gave a speech on the floor of Congress and talked about this. And unfortunately, he didn't say a whole lot about what their conversation entailed. But I have a hunch of what it might have looked like. I have to imagine that Abraham Lincoln said to him, "Can you tell me the story? Can you tell me about how you stole the Planter?" That's the thing Lincoln would have wanted to know. Now, why does this matter? Well, up to this point in the war, African Americans had been offering their services to the Union war effort, and Abraham Lincoln had roundly rejected black soldiers who were volunteering. But now, Abraham Lincoln met a black man who proved his valor and his bravery, not on the battlefield, but essentially on a battlefield. And Lincoln was persuaded that black men could serve in a meaningful way. And Lincoln the War Department then gave Robert Smalls a letter that he took back to Charleston, or I should say back to Beaufort, South Carolina. Charleston wouldn't fall for another 3 years, but back to Beaufort. And it allowed for the recruitment of black soldiers. And the 1st and 2nd South Carolina volunteers, black regiments were raised because of this letter that Smalls brought back with him that he got as a result of meeting with Abraham Lincoln. And I think this is an incredible thing where Lincoln changed his public policy because of a meeting with a black soldier, or with a black man. On January 1st, 1863, so a few months later, Lincoln would issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which would officially allow for black men to join the Union Army. But just because black men were now joining the Army doesn't mean that they received full equality. They received unequal pay, they received subpar uniforms and weapons. They enlisted expecting to be paid $13 a month, which is what white Union soldiers received. Instead, they were paid as laborers under the Militia Act of 1862, so they only got $10 a month. And not only that, laborers had to pay $3 a month for a clothing allowance. So they expected $13 a month, they're getting $7 a month. And they would write to Lincoln and say, you know, Confederate bullets don't discriminate on account of the color of our skin. We are just as likely to get shot as a white soldier. And not only that, the Confederate government instituted a policy, an official policy, that black men and their white officers who were caught in combat, who were captured on the battlefield, would be treated as slaves in insurrection and executed or sold into bondage. And so beginning in 1863, black soldiers and their families start writing to Lincoln, calling for protection from Confederate atrocities and calling for equal pay. Well, in August of 1863, Frederick Douglass decided to press this issue. He had been recruiting black soldiers in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. 2 of his sons had joined the 54th Massachusetts, and he was very upset that he had been telling black volunteers, you'll get paid $13 a month, and instead they're in practice only getting $7. And so he goes to the White House in August of 1863, uninvited and unannounced. Frederick Douglass did not know what would happen when he showed up, but he showed up anyway. And he went into Lincoln's office, and Lincoln approached him and stuck out his hand, shook Douglass by the hand, and then led him in, holding Douglass's hand, led him into a seat. And Douglass tried to introduce himself, and Lincoln said, oh, I know who you are. And they had a conversation where Douglass pushed him on these issues of unequal pay and Confederate atrocities. On the issue of unequal pay, Lincoln said that it was pushing things pretty far already to allow black men to fight, that there was a lot of white resistance in the North to even allowing black soldiers to fight, and there just wasn't the political capital to allow for equal pay. But Lincoln said it will come. On the issue of Confederate atrocities, Lincoln said that if he could capture the Confederates who committed atrocities, he would certainly have them punished, but he didn't want to punish an innocent Confederate POW for the war crime committed by someone on the battlefield. Now, as you might imagine, Frederick Douglass was not altogether satisfied with these answers. But this meeting impressed Douglass. It gave him a sense of the political realities that Lincoln was facing. After all, Lincoln had an electorate. He had a constituency in the North that was very highly racist and that was not going to support more radical policies. And the other thing that stuck in Douglass's mind was that Lincoln in no way treated him differently on account of the color of his skin. A few months later, Douglass gave a speech in Boston and another one in New York, and he talked about what it was like to meet with Lincoln. And Douglass turned to the audience at one of these speeches and he said, I suppose you would like to know how a Negro was greeted at the White House by the president. And as you were not there, I will tell you. And he said, he greeted me as one gentleman would greet another. And then Douglass said, to great applause and laughter, I felt big there. Now, so far I've told you about 2 very famous black visitors, Robert Smalls and Frederick Douglass. But there were some less famous visitors. In fact, most of the people that Lincoln met with were not very well known then or now. And one of the things we have to realize is that in the 19th century, the president held office hours in the same way that I, as a college professor at Christopher Newport University, do. So if I'm in my office, students can come talk to me about whatever they want, and they see me in there and they come chat, and it's great. Lincoln did that too. Lincoln held office hours several days a week, and anyone who wanted to could get in line and wait for their turn to talk to the president. For the first year of the war, only white people took advantage of this. But beginning as early as April of 1862, black men and women began waiting in line and going to talk to Lincoln as well. Well, this is Alexander Augusta, and he's, I think, one of the most interesting people to meet with Lincoln during the Civil War. Alexander Augusta had been born into a free black family in Norfolk, Virginia in the 1820s, about 1825-26. In the 1830s, his family moved to Baltimore, and I think it was a result of Nat Turner's Rebellion. Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831 led Virginia authorities to clamp down on the rights of free black people and to make life even worse for enslaved people. and I think his family decided to leave. They moved to Baltimore, where Augusta became a barber, which was a respectable middle-class profession for African-American men. But Augusta really wanted to be a doctor. He applied to the University of Pennsylvania and was denied admission on account of his race, and so he moved to Toronto and attended Trinity Medical College in the 1850s. He got his MD and practiced for 6 years and trained other black doctors. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, Augusta saw this as a sign, and he sent this letter to Abraham Lincoln less than a week after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, telling Lincoln, "I want to be of some use to my race." He explained how he left the country to become a doctor, and now he wanted to come back to serve in a black regiment. And the War Department gave Augusta an invitation to come to Washington, D.C. to be examined. So Augusta travels from Toronto to Washington, and when he gets to Washington, D.C., he is brought before the examining board, and the examining surgeon sees that he appears to be of African descent. And so they write to the War Department and try to have his invitation rescinded. But the War Department says, no, you will examine him. So then the examining surgeon, a doctor named Cronin, puts Augusta through what he called a squeezing process, asked him the hardest questions he could come up with. And Augusta passed with flying colors. And afterwards, the Surgeon General went to the examining surgeon, and he said, "I say, Cronin, how is it that you came to let the N-word pass?" And the examining surgeon said, "The truth is, sir, the N-word knew more than I did, and I couldn't help myself." Well, Augusta gets commissioned a major in the U.S. Army. He is the highest-ranking black soldier of the Civil War era. But he still faces discrimination. At one point, he's traveling through Baltimore, and he is violently beaten up by a mob who rips off his epaulets, the sign of his rank, punch him in the face, give him a bloody nose. On another occasion, he's traveling through Washington, D.C. to testify before a military court, and he goes to get onto a streetcar, and the conductor says, "You can ride in the back, or you can ride on the front, outside of the streetcar with the driver. You don't get to ride in the car itself. That only white people get to ride there." And Augusta didn't take this stuff sitting down. He took his story to the newspapers, and in fact, the Senate of the United States debated what happened to him. And this made national headlines. And one newspaper very rudely wrote, "If this black doctor is so upset about the way he's being treated, he should take it up with his commander-in-chief." Now, I don't think that Augusta ever saw that editorial, because it was actually published in Indiana, but that's exactly what Alexander Augusta decided to do. In February of 1864, he and another black doctor named Anderson Abbott, who had been trained by Augusta in Toronto, they went to the White House for an evening party. It was a Tuesday evening. The president and first lady had a reception that was open to anyone who wanted to come. And for the first time in the history of these receptions, two black people decide, we are citizens, we are soldiers, we will go to this as well. They put on their uniforms and show up at the White House. They hear the music coming out. They go in, they take off their winter wraps and hand them to a servant. They then get in line to shake the president's hand. Abbott, the man on the right, left an account of this. And Abbott said that as soon as the president saw them, Lincoln eagerly, and that's Abbott's word, Lincoln eagerly approached Alexander Augusta and shook his hand. Now, Mary Lincoln looked over and saw this and did not like what she saw. She sent her son Robert over to the president. And Robert went to his father and said, "Are you really going to allow this innovation?" And Lincoln turned to his son and said, "Why not?" And Robert slinked back to his mother, and Lincoln turned back to Augusta and shook his hand, and then turned to Anderson Abbott and shook his hand. And these two black men then went through the East Room of the White House, which I'm sure you all have seen on television, if not in person, this beautiful room, and hundreds of white people were in there enjoying the reception, and these two black doctors walked through the East Room. They spent about a half hour in there, and as they walked through, Abbott said they tried to pretend like they were paying attention to the music and the beautiful artwork on the walls, but their adrenaline was just so high, they were doing everything they could to keep their composure. And Abbott said that as they walked through the room, the crowd just hollowed out around them, and you can imagine all of these eyes staring at them. with a mixture of wonder and amazement and disbelief and anger that these men would do this. One of Lincoln's private secretaries was there, a man named William Stoddard. And Stoddard later said that this was a practical assertion of Negro citizenship for which few were prepared. In other words, these guys were saying, we are soldiers, we are citizens, we deserve to come to the White House. This is our people's house too. Black men also made explicit claims for citizenship. In the spring of 1864, in January of 1864, 1,000 black men in Louisiana wrote out a petition and signed a petition calling for black voting rights. Now, out of these 1,000, they were wealthy, educated, light-skinned African Americans. They were known as Creoles. So they have African, French, Spanish, and English ancestry. And these are very wealthy people. They were born free, they are educated, and they claim because of their status, they should have the right to vote. And the first two were signed by this man here, Arnold Burtneau, and one of his friends. And then the next 28 signatures were actually black veterans of Andrew Jackson's army in the War of 1812. And they pointed out, we've served our country in the past, and we're serving it today. And they signed this petition in January of 1864, and in March of 1864, these two black men show up at the White House and present it to Lincoln. And Lincoln sits down with them in his office, and he talks about how they should have the right to vote, but the right to vote is a right that's controlled at the state level. And he says, as president, I have no control over the right to vote. But he tells them, if you can come up with a way that voting rights can be connected to winning the war, then it's something that I, as president, can have a say in. And there were a couple of white gentlemen in the room who watched this interaction, who were furious at how the president treated them with respect and talked about them, they should have the right to vote. Well, Burtneau and Rudneau, these two men, they go away from the White House. And on March 10th, about a week later, they write out a new petition. And I can't prove this, but I think they came back to the White House on March 12th and brought this new petition to Lincoln. And this is the new petition. And in this new petition, they make a new claim. Originally, they had only called for light-skinned, free-born, wealthy, educated black men to have the right to vote. And in this new version, they called for all black men to have the right to vote, whether or not they were educated, whether or not they were born free. And this is the last page of the petition. And they say, and I'm going to try to read it, they say that it should affect equally the white and the colored citizens, and that this is required not only by justice, but also by expediency, which demands that full effect should be given to all the Union feeling in the rebel states in order to secure the permanence of free institutions and loyal governments. What are they saying? At some point, the Civil War will end and the Confederate States will be brought back into the Union. And when that happens, there's going to be a lot of white voters who were disloyal, and there's going to be a lot of black people who were loyal during the war. And if you want Reconstruction to work, you've got to bring the black electorate in. And Lincoln listened to this argument and was persuaded by it. And the very next day, on March 13th, he sent a private letter to the governor-elect of Louisiana, a man named Michael Hahn. And he called for Hahn to support black suffrage as Louisiana was coming back into the Union. And Lincoln wrote these beautiful words, "I barely suggest for your private consideration whether some of the colored people may not be let in, as, for instance, the very intelligent, meaning the educated, and especially those who have fought gallantly in our ranks. They would probably help in some trying time to come to keep the jewel of liberty within the family of freedom." In other words, if we want liberty to survive in this country, we need black voters as well as white. Another delegation of black men came to the White House in April of 1864, so a month after the two men from Louisiana. They were led by Abraham Galloway. Abraham Galloway had been born into slavery in the 20s or 30s in North Carolina. He escaped out of slavery on a turpentine ship from North Carolina up to Philadelphia, where he was rescued by William Still, the famous black abolitionist. And William Still described finding Abraham Galloway and the turpentine in the hold of this ship. The turpentine had caused his pores to open, and his body was just bleeding profusely. But Galloway was now free. During the Civil War, Galloway returned to the South, where he became a spy for Union General Benjamin Butler. And after the Union gained control of New Bern, North Carolina, Galloway became the head of black military recruitment in that area. And in April of 1864, he brought a petition to the White House, he and 5 other black men, some of whom had been born free, some of whom had been born into bondage. And in this petition, they pointed out that black men had voted in North Carolina from 1776 until 1835, and there had never been any issue with it. And they pointed out that black men were serving in the Union, and that they were loyal, and that they too should have the right to vote. And again, Lincoln welcomed them into his White House office and shook hands with them and said to them, "You should have the right to vote. I don't have the power over voting because that's a state privilege, but I will support you in this." And these men went back to North Carolina and talked about what it was like to meet with Lincoln. And one of them, I'm going to read just a very little bit out of the book for this. One of them, when he got to North Carolina, described what it was like. Oh, there it is. And he said this. He said that if any black person had gone to the home of the lowest magistrate in Craven County, North Carolina, and attempted to go to the front door, it would have been an insult for the person of color to do that. And he said, should such a thing occur, the black offender would have been told, "Go around to the back door." That was the place for the N-words. But then this man who had met with Lincoln likened Lincoln to Christ. He likened him to the Sermon on the Mount, and he said, "We knock, the door is open to us. We seek the president and find him to the joy and comfort of our hearts. We ask and receive his sympathies and promises for all he could do for us." And he went on to say that Lincoln treated them as if they had been the ambassadors from Japan. Now, it wasn't just black men who met with Lincoln. A woman named Caroline Johnson traveled from Philadelphia to meet with Lincoln in April of 1864, the same month that this delegation from North Carolina came. And Caroline Johnson was a very talented artist, and she would make displays of wax fruit. And she decided to make one for Lincoln. It cost her $150 to make it, had a retail value of $350. And in April of 1864, she brought it to the White House and presented it to Lincoln. And I'm showing you here a map of the White House because I don't have an image of her meeting with Lincoln, but she gave this to Lincoln in what was then the library of the White House, which is the Oval Room looking out at the Washington Monument. And this is a very significant thing because the library of the White House was part of the private family space. Outside people were not welcomed here. Only the president's family and their most intimate guests. But Lincoln welcomed Caroline Johnson and her black Baptist minister to meet with them, and she presented this beautiful display of fruit. And her minister said a few words, and then he turned to Caroline Johnson and said, "Perhaps Mrs. Johnson would like to say a few things." And Caroline Johnson was very nervous. It's understandable. Here she is speaking to the President of the United States, and she looked down at her feet not knowing what to say. But then she said she felt a fire come over her as if it was the Holy Spirit. And her mind went to the book of Isaiah, chapter 51, where the Old Testament prophet said this, "Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness. Look to the rock from which you were hewn. Look to Abraham your father." And with those words in her mind, she said, "Mr. President, I believe God has hewn you out of a rock for this great and mighty purpose. Many have been led away by bribes of gold, of silver, of presents, but you have stood firm because God was with you, and if you are faithful to the end, he will be with you." And Lincoln was moved to tears, and he said, "Don't give thanks to me, give thanks to God." Frederick Douglass came back to the White House in August of 1864, this time at the president's invitation. The war was going very badly for the Union in the spring and summer of 1864, and by August, Lincoln was convinced that he would lose in his bid for re-election. And so he called Frederick Douglass to come to the White House and meet with him. And he said to Douglass, "Douglass, I hate slavery as much as you do, and I want to see it abolished altogether." But Lincoln explained the problem. He had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and slaves were not running away in as great of numbers as he had hoped they would. And what Lincoln feared was he would lose in his bid for re-election in November of 1864. A Democrat would defeat him and rescind the Emancipation Proclamation, and the golden opportunity for freedom would be gone. And so Lincoln and Douglass sat down together and came up with a plan where they would send bands of scouts into the Confederacy telling the slaves, "Run away now while you have a chance, because when Lincoln is gone from office, your golden opportunity will be gone." Now, fortunately, things took a turn for the better for the Union, and Sherman captured Atlanta, and Lincoln sailed to re-election, and nothing ever had to come of this plan. But Douglass was extraordinarily moved by this meeting. He said, "What Lincoln said on that day showed a deeper moral conviction against slavery than I had ever seen before in anything spoken or written by him." And what Douglass came to see was that Lincoln's heart was fully in black freedom. When we talk about emancipation today, we usually say, well, the Emancipation Proclamation was only a war measure. Lincoln did it to win the war, to save the Union. He really didn't do it because he cared about black freedom. But if you look at this moment and think about the plan that Lincoln and Douglass came up with to free the slaves, it had nothing to do with winning the war. It had nothing to do with saving the Union. It had everything to do with making freedom as broad and as permanent for as many people as possible before Lincoln was out of power. And this meeting caused Douglass to have a life, for the rest of his life, to love Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln also met with Sojourner Truth. I don't want to go too long, so if you want to hear about that, I can talk about that during the Q&A. But I want to just close by telling a few other very quick stories about Lincoln not only meeting black people in the White House, but around Washington, D.C. In May of 1862, Lincoln went to a hospital in Washington, D.C. to shake the hands of convalescing soldiers and to thank them for their service to the country. At that point, all the soldiers are white, and he is shaking their hands and thanking them. And there was a white nurse at this hospital, and she brought Lincoln over and introduced him to 3 black cooks. And Lincoln went over to those cooks, and they had escaped from slavery in Kentucky and Virginia, and Lincoln shook their hands. And he greeted them by their first names. "How are you, Lucy? How do you do, Garner? How do you do, Brown?" And what Lincoln didn't see, but the nurse saw, was that the white soldiers behind him were watching this scene, cursing him for shaking the hands of what they called the N-words. But it didn't matter to Lincoln. These were 3 people who were serving the nation, and he was going to treat them with dignity and respect. In Washington, D.C., near where Howard University is today, there was a contraband camp. This is a black refugee camp where refugees from slavery would go and live. And this photograph behind me shows some of the black refugees in this contraband camp in Washington, D.C. And if you look very closely at the photograph, you'll see that they're holding songbooks. And there are accounts that come down to us from one of the black refugees, a woman named Mary Dines, who had escaped from slavery in Maryland. She was living at this contraband camp, and she had a beautiful voice, was a beautiful singer. And one time when Lincoln was going to the contraband camp, someone there called on Mary Dines to sing for the president. And she sang for him. She was very nervous singing for the president. And then the other black refugees began singing as well. And when Lincoln would pass between the White House and the soldiers' home, he would stop here, and the black refugees would sing for him. And so this is a photograph of them singing, or preparing to sing, waiting for his arrival. And Mary Dines left these recollections of what it was like to sing for the president. And she talked about how Lincoln would get choked up and weep as he hears these people who had just escaped from slavery singing in freedom. How his voice was not the best voice, but it was a strong voice. How he would call on them, call on a black minister there named Uncle Ben to pray. And one of the things that she noted was that she expected Lincoln to laugh at them, because these black refugees from slavery were much more charismatic in their religious experiences and practices than Lincoln was, clapping and dancing and shouting. But she made note of the fact that Lincoln never laughed. And there's that sentiment again. We saw it in Hannibal Cox's letter at the beginning, and we see it in Mary Dines' account at the end, that when Lincoln met with African Americans, he universally, there's one exception to the rule, but universally treated black visitors with the utmost respect, listening to their concerns and doing what he could for them. And it's little wonder that when Lincoln died in April of 1865, African Americans knew that they had lost more in his death than anyone else. And hundreds of black men, women, and children came to the White House and stood outside of the White House on April 15th, 1865, weeping his loss. I hope that in these few minutes you get a sense of a history that has been lost for about 150 years. After Lincoln's death, subsequent presidents were not as welcoming to black people at the White House. By the time Booker T. Washington was invited to the White House by Teddy Roosevelt in 1901, white Southerners see this as an outrage that black people would be, a black man in this case, would be welcomed into the White House. And even into the 20th century, FDR would not invite Jesse Owens into the White House after he won the gold medal in the 36 Olympics. And JFK would not allow Sammy Davis Jr. to stay at the White House in the 1960s. And it's not now until 150 years later that we've begun to recover this story of these interactions between black men and women and a president of the United States more than 150 years ago. So thank you so much for braving the rain and coming out. And if we have time, I'd love to take some questions and I guess wait for the mic to come to you.
Exactly. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone to you so that we can get the recording done. Does anybody have a question? Just raise your hand.
Yes, sir. The one exception.
The one exception. The one exception is one of the most famous meetings that Lincoln had with black men. It was August of 1862, very same time where Lincoln's meeting with Robert Smalls. Lincoln had decided to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. He decided that in July of 1862. The problem is the war was going very badly for the Union. And so his Secretary of State persuaded him, don't issue the Emancipation Proclamation until we win a victory on the battlefield, because otherwise it will look like a sign of weakness to the powers of the world. And Lincoln heeded that advice. So he waited from July 22nd until September 22nd. So he waits for 2 months until he can finally issue his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And during that period of 2 months, Lincoln does several things to help prepare the white racist northern electorate for what is coming. So one of those things that he does is he issues a public letter to a man named Horace Greeley, where he says, my paramount object in this war is to save the Union, is not to either save or destroy slavery. And people bludgeon Lincoln today for that letter, saying, see, Lincoln didn't care about black people, he only cared about the Union. What's often lost is that Lincoln issued that letter having already decided emancipation is where we're going, we just politically can't do it yet. Another thing that Lincoln did in August of 1862 was he invited black leaders from Washington, D.C. to come to the White House to talk about colonization. Colonization was a plan or scheme that had been around for 50, 60, 70 years before the Civil War. And the idea was black people and white people aren't going to be able to live together, so we will send freed slaves somewhere else. So Liberia gets founded as a way to try to colonize African Americans. And during the Civil War, Lincoln was pushing colonization either to Liberia or to Haiti or to what is now known as Panama. And so on August 14th, 1862, Lincoln has a meeting with a man from Norfolk, actually, who had gone on to become the president of Liberia. And that man came and met with Lincoln and said, hey, you should send as many black people as you can to Liberia. And then in the afternoon, Lincoln met with a delegation of 5 black leaders from Washington. And this is the exception. Lincoln called them into the White House. And so on the one hand, this was incredible. This is the first time in the history of the country that the President of the United States has ever invited black people to the White House to talk politics with them. But then, after very cordially shaking their hands and welcoming them in, he then proceeds to lecture them for 45 minutes about how black people are the cause of the war, and if they weren't here, white men wouldn't be slitting each other's throats, and you should get other black people to leave the country. Now, Lincoln, this is one of the, like, 3 moments as a Lincoln's guy that I'm like, Abe, come on, man, you're killing me. If you hadn't said these 3, like that and 2 other things, you'd be golden. But we have to make sense of what was Lincoln doing here. Lincoln brought a stenographer into the meeting to write down every word that he said. Why? Because Lincoln wanted it broadcast out to the nation. Because he knew there was a very racist white electorate who did not want emancipation. And so what Lincoln was trying to do was persuade them, when emancipation comes, you don't need to be worried about it because I'm going to try to push this colonization thing too. The downside is that Lincoln was terribly condescending to these visitors. It's the one time that Lincoln is condescending towards them. But here's the upshot that had not been known until this past year. Remember that guy Henry McNeil Turner, the black minister and journalist who had met Robert Smalls? Lincoln brought Henry McNeil Turner to the White House. And Lincoln said to him, this whole colonization thing, you don't really need to worry about it. Lincoln said, I needed somewhere to point to. In other words, like a magician uses misdirection, Lincoln needed somewhere to point people's attention so that he could do the bigger thing he wanted to do, which was emancipation. And here's what's really remarkable about this. Lincoln never told anyone what he was thinking. He didn't keep a diary. His letters are often very coy. And his law partner said Lincoln was the most shut-mouthed man I ever knew. And who does Lincoln trust? The one guy he trusts his innermost thoughts with here is a black pastor from Washington, D.C. And so I don't shy away from colonization in the book because I think it's very important to deal with. But the title of my chapter on this meeting is this. It's a quote from Horace Greeley, the white abolitionist. Not Horace Greeley, William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison called that meeting a spectacle as humiliating as it was extraordinary. It was humiliating to see the president treat black people that way, be condescending towards them. It was extraordinary that the meeting happened. So that's the one exception. Every other meeting, Lincoln never acts that way.
Are there any other questions for Dr. White? Anyone?
Are you getting any feedback with this book about critical race theory?
Yeah, I've done, 50 public talks on these 2 books since the first one. The Book of Letters came out in October, and then the Black Visitors to the White House came out in February. And so I get a lot of questions when I do public talks, and then there's an organization for urban schools nationally that had me come in and talk to their leaders, who then sort of take what I say down to the teachers in urban schools they wanted me to talk about how do you grapple with difficult subjects in such a divisive era. And the thing that I do as a college professor, I teach down the road at CNU, the thing that I do is as much as possible, use primary sources to teach my students. And the other thing that I do is I try to find documents where the authors disagree with one another. So I will pair documents together and, Federalist versus Anti-Federalist, or Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, or Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, or Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Just get readings where the writers disagree with each other. And what I have found that enables me to do is to get students to think critically on their own and learn how to analyze the documents without me telling them how to think. And I always say to my students, I don't want you to try to think how I think, and I'm not going to tell you what I think. I want you to learn how to think. And you can come to whatever conclusions you want as long as they're rooted in the material. And that's what I wish more teachers and professors did. And then you don't have to shy away from the hard topics, because you'll have hard conversations and difficult conversations in class. But I think if students are given the privilege of being able to wrestle with difficult things, and if they're given the context to help understand those documents, it's remarkable the ideas they can come up with. So I've been teaching about critical race theory since 2012. But I teach it in conjunction with a speech given by Clarence Thomas, who is complete opposite of critical race theory. And so they read people who support, in my classes, they read supporters and opponents of critical race theory. And I don't try to indoctrinate my students to think in any particular way. I want them to see the ideas, and different students will come to different conclusions. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's how I've kind of grappled with it. And I will sometimes hear students in the hallways of my building, hey, do you know what Dr. White's politics are? And I'm kind of glad when I hear that, because I don't need to wear it on my sleeve, and I know, this is the other thing. This is more than you bargained for in your question. I know there are some students who, if I just came out and said, well, this is what I believe and I want you to think the way I do, there are some students who would turn me off and never listen in class. Whereas if I present what I think are interesting ideas, whether I agree with them or not, and I assign a lot of readings that I don't agree with, and the students don't even know which ones I agree with and which ones I don't, then they have the freedom to think. And that's my goal just in education, is to get them to do that. So.
Thank you, Dr. White. Does anybody else have a question for Dr. White? Well, I think what you've done, intertwining Lincoln's humanity with his political side, is incredibly interesting, to say the very least. Okay. Thanks, Dr. White.